May 15, 1853, Charleston, South Carolina. A date forever carved into the marble headstones of the Whitfield family cemetery. Louisa, that was the name of the woman who, armed with nothing but a porcelain milk basin and a grief too deep to drown, forever silenced the cries that had haunted her dreams for months. A wet nurse, 26 years old, born in the shadow of Charleston's grand mansions, trained to give her milk to white babies while her own child starved in her arms. But that spring morning, Louisa did not feed. She did not nurture. She did not obey. Louisa killed. With the same basin she had used for months to sustain her mistress's child, she filled it with death, watching as the porcelain turned from white to witness. What began as another quiet morning in the Whitfield nursery, filled with cooing and gentle lullabies, turned into a reckoning of milk, motherhood, and vengeance. In less than 5 minutes, the air was silent on the Persian rug. Louisa wasn't driven by madness. She was driven by love stolen, milk demanded, silence imposed, and the memory of her stillborn child, denied even a proper burial while she was forced to feed another woman's baby with the milk meant for her own. The Mistress Evelyn Whitfield had called her the Lord's chosen servant for white life, while Louisa's baby grew cold in a wooden box behind the servants' quarters. This is the true story of Louisa Maynard, who turned nourishment into poison and watched a mistress pray over the very destruction she had created. Before we continue with this story, drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. While Charleston's grand houses glowed with morning light, the servants' quarters breathed in shadow. The sun hung low over the harbor, golden and warm like honey poured over cobblestones. Across the city, windows sparkled with crystal and lace. Breakfast tables groaned under silver platters of eggs and ham. Children played in manicured gardens while their mothers planned afternoon teas and evening galas. It was May 1853, a season of blooming magnolias and prosperity, of silk dresses and polished carriages. But in the Whitfield mansion, the air carried a different weight. There the morning light couldn't reach the back rooms where the help lived. The smell wasn't fresh biscuits, but stale grief and sour milk. The only warmth came from the kitchen fires, not enough to heal hearts, only enough to cook the food that would never fill the right bellies. No laughter echoed from these halls, just whispered prayers and the soft shuffle of feet trained never to disturb. Louisa sat in the nursery's corner chair, her dress clean but faded, her hair pulled tight beneath a white cap. She looked like any other house servant, shoulders straight, eyes downcast, hands steady on the milk basin. But her eyes had stopped seeing the present. She was staring at the sleeping infant, but seeing another face, another child, her child. The one who never drew breath, never cried, never tasted the milk that now sustained this pale stranger. His face would not leave her memory. His stillness haunted every feeding, every gentle rock, every lullaby hummed to a child that was not hers. She had begged to bury him properly, to say goodbye, to hold him one last time. But Evelyn Whitfield had laughed, that sharp cutting sound like breaking glass. "Dead Negro babies don't need ceremonies," she had said, sipping her morning tea. "You're meant to feed the living. Remember your place." That night they threw his tiny body in the servants' plot, unmarked, unblessed, forgotten by everyone except the woman whose milk was stolen to feed their precious heir. Earlier that morning, Louisa had prepared the basin as always. The porcelain was cool against her palms, smooth, perfect, like everything else in this house built on suffering. She tested its weight, felt its edges, memorized the way it caught the light. She wasn't thinking of feeding. She was thinking of endings. Inside the grand parlor, Evelyn Whitfield was entertaining her sister, discussing the latest fashions from Paris while their children played with ivory toys. Two women draped in silk and self-righteousness, speaking of charity work and Christian duty, while the woman who fed their babies grieved alone in the shadows. They spoke of Louisa as if she were furniture, a milk-producing fixture, useful but invisible. "She's been so quiet lately," Evelyn mentioned, stirring sugar into her tea. "Good. Quiet ones know their place." Her sister nodded, glancing toward the nursery where Louisa sat with the baby. Such a blessing to have reliable help. Some of them get ideas above their station. They laughed, the sound echoing through rooms built on the backs of people they considered less than human. But in the nursery something was changing. Louisa lifted the basin, feeling its familiar weight, but seeing it differently now. It was no longer just a feeding vessel. It was memory made manifest, grief given form, love turned inside out. The baby stirred in his crib, making soft sounds, reaching tiny fingers toward the light streaming through lace curtains. Innocent, unaware that his life had been built on another's death, that his nourishment came from a mother forced to forget her own child. This is Louisa Maynard, who turned a basin into a weapon, and motherhood into reckoning. While the city celebrated spring's arrival, Louisa remembered only winter. The grand Charleston home sparkled with crystal chandeliers and mahogany furniture, their gardens blooming with jasmine and roses that perfumed the air with sweetness that never reached the back quarters. But behind the main houses, in the servants' quarters where enslaved mothers lived and died in silence, the air smelled of damp wood, old tears, and milk gone sour from hearts too broken to sweeten it. The contrast was deliberate, designed, crafted with the precision of architects who understood that suffering required careful construction. This was a world built on the backs of the forgotten, where wealth grew from human misery like flowers from graves. Louisa's world had once held different sounds, different hopes, different possibilities that seemed as real as the child growing inside her belly. Before her womb swelled with new life, before she learned that even pregnancy belonged to her mistress, before she understood that her body was not her own but merely another tool in the Whitfield arsenal, she had dared to dream. In the quiet hours between dawn and duty, she would place her hands on her rounded stomach and whisper promises to the life stirring within. She spoke of freedom someday, of a name that would mean something more than property, of mornings without masters and nights without fear. She felt him move inside her, strong kicks that felt like tiny fists fighting for space, for air, for a chance at life in a world that had already decided he didn't deserve one. Each movement was a conversation, a connection, a love letter written in the language of heartbeats and hope. She would hum old songs her own mother had sung, melodies that carried the weight of generations who had loved their children despite knowing they could never truly protect them. But the Whitfield house had different plans for both mother and child. When her time came, when the labor pains started in the middle of a cold March night, they brought her not to the comfortable rooms where white women gave birth, but to the cold stone room behind the kitchen where tools were stored and meat was butchered. No doctor with gentle hands, no midwife who understood the sacred nature of birth, just old Martha with her rough palms and tired eyes that had seen too much death to believe in life. The labor was long, brutal. A war fought in a room that smelled of lye and old blood. Louisa bit down on leather straps to keep from screaming, not from pain but from the knowledge that her cries would disturb the master's sleep. Martha worked with grim efficiency, her face a mask that revealed nothing, promised nothing, hoped for nothing. When the baby finally came, he was blue and perfect and silent, his tiny chest still as morning water. Louisa held him for less than an hour, memorizing every finger, every eyelash, every feature that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her shortened life. His skin was soft as silk, his hair dark as midnight, his face peaceful in a way that told her he had never known suffering. She whispered his name, the one she had chosen months before, the one that meant beloved in the old language her grandmother had taught her. But names were luxuries enslaved children couldn't afford. No time for grieving, Evelyn had said, standing in the doorway like a pale specter, her white nightgown making her look like death itself come calling. My son needs feeding. Your milk belongs to him now. God's will be done. The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of pain that would spread outward until they reached every corner of Louisa's existence. They buried her child in the unmarked section of the servants' cemetery. No headstone, no prayer, no acknowledgement that a life had tried to begin and failed. Just a small hole in hard ground, covered quickly, forgotten deliberately. But 3 days later, when Evelyn's son was born pink and screaming into silk sheets and warm rooms filled with joy and possibility, Louisa was dragged from her bed, her breasts heavy with milk meant for the child she would never hold again. The cruelty was precise, calculated, designed with the kind of attention to detail that wealthy people applied to their gardens and dinner parties. Every morning, as she fed the Whitfield baby, her body remembered its loss. Her arms ached for the weight they would never carry. Her heart broke again with the fresh knowledge that love was not enough to keep anything safe in this world. The milk that flowed from her body was supposed to be love made liquid, meant to nourish her own child's dreams and strengthen his small bones for the fights ahead. Instead, it sustained the lineage of people who saw her as livestock, useful only for what her body could produce, valued only for her ability to transform her grief into their gain. Evelyn made sure Louisa understood the arrangement completely, explaining it with the patience of a teacher instructing a slow student. God chose you to serve, she would say, watching with cold satisfaction as Louisa's face remained perfectly still, perfectly obedient, perfectly broken. Your purpose is to give life to those who matter, to nourish the future that belongs to your betters. Don't forget that. Don't ever forget your place in his divine plan. Louisa never replied, never protested, never let her face show the storm building behind her dark eyes. She nodded when expected, smiled when required, moved through her days like a ghost haunting her own life. But late at night, when the house slept and the moonlight crept through her small window like fingers reaching for her soul, she would hold the empty milk basin and remember. She remembered her child's face, the weight of him in her arms, the promise she never got to keep, the name she never got to speak aloud. She remembered the sound of dirt hitting his tiny coffin, the way Evelyn had smiled while watching, the casual cruelty of people who had turned suffering into entertainment. She stared at the basin until the porcelain seemed to glow in the darkness, until it became more than a tool, more than a vessel, more than a reminder of her servitude. It became a possibility, a question, a door that could open onto something that looked like justice. And slowly, quietly, in the space between heartbeats and hope, she stopped being the woman who obeyed and became the woman who planned. The milk basin sat on her lap like a prayer, like a weapon, like the only justice she would ever be allowed to claim. And in the silence of those midnight hours, surrounded by the sounds of a house built on bones, Louisa began to understand that some kinds of love require blood to speak their names. She stared at flames but saw her child, and then she stopped being human. Louisa studied the basin's smooth curve with the intensity of a scholar reading sacred text, running her fingers along its perfect white surface that remained unmarked by the darkness it would soon hold. She learned the weight of it empty, the subtle shift when filled with milk, how long it took for liquid to settle into stillness, how deep the mixture needed to be to ensure there would be no mistakes, no second chances, no mercy for those who had shown none. This wasn't madness flowering in a broken mind. This was mathematics, precision born from months of careful observation and patient grief that had crystallized into something harder than diamond, sharper than any blade. She knew Evelyn's routines by heart, had memorized them with the dedication of a hunter learning the patterns of dangerous prey. Morning prayers at 7 sharp, always kneeling beside the baby's crib with her hands clasped in perfect piety, eyes closed in performance of devotion, completely absorbed in her daily conversation with a God who apparently favored white children over black ones. Her voice would rise and fall in practiced rhythms, words of gratitude for blessings built on others' suffering, thanks for prosperity watered with tears she had never shed. The morning feeding came after prayers, Evelyn settling into her velvet chair to watch with the satisfaction of a plantation owner surveying a productive field. She took visible pleasure in these moments, watching as Louisa nursed the child that lived while her own lay cold in unmarked earth. Sometimes she would comment on the baby's appetite, his growth, his resemblance to his father, speaking as if Louisa were deaf as well as enslaved, as if her presence was no more significant than that of a milk cow brought in from pasture. Evelyn Whitfield was Charleston aristocracy, distilled to its purest, most toxic form. Born into wealth that stretched back 3 generations, raised on stories of divine favor and natural superiority, educated in the finest schools that taught her to read Latin but not human faces, to calculate profits but not the cost of suffering. She wore her Christianity like expensive jewelry, polished and displayed for public admiration but never truly understood, never allowed to penetrate the hardened shell of her heart. She quoted scripture about servants obeying their masters while denying basic humanity to those who served her, spoke of God's love while practicing the devil's cruelty, prayed for blessings while creating curses for others. Her religion was convenient, comfortable, carefully crafted to justify whatever she wanted to do. She could find biblical support for any cruelty, divine approval for any excess, heavenly sanction for any sin, as long as it served her interests. Her cruelty wasn't passionate or wild like a storm that rages and passes. It was calculated, delivered with the same calm precision she used to arrange flowers or plan dinner parties. She had made Louisa watch as they buried her stillborn son, standing over the unmarked grave with a smile that never reached her cold blue eyes, speaking words designed to carve themselves into memory like epitaphs on tombstones. "See how quickly God's will is done," she had whispered, her breath visible in the cold morning air. "See how he removes obstacles to his greater plan? Now you understand your true purpose, your real value in his divine design. You exist to serve life, not to create it for yourself." The absent Mr. Whitfield was no better, perhaps worse, for his casual indifference to the suffering he caused. A merchant who traded in human flesh and called it business, who spoke of shipping costs and profit margins without ever seeing faces, hearing names, acknowledging the humanity of his cargo. His ships brought enslaved people from Africa to Charleston's docks, where they were sold like cattle in the market squares, while he counted money and planned expansion. When he was home, which was rarely, he treated the house servants like invisible furniture, useful but unworthy of acknowledgement, present but not truly alive in his estimation. He would walk past Louisa as if she were air, speak over her as if she were stone, make decisions about her life as if she were property to be disposed of at will. His indifference was somehow more insulting than Evelyn's active cruelty, suggesting that she wasn't even worth the effort of hatred. The household chaplain, Reverend Morrison, was perhaps the worst of all because he wrapped his poison in holy words and delivered damnation with a smile. He preached about the divine order that placed white masters above black servants, about God's plan that required some to suffer so others could prosper, about the blessed nature of servitude when performed with proper humility and gratitude. Every Sunday, he read from carefully selected Bible verses about obedience and submission, never mentioning the parts about love, compassion, justice, or the radical equality of souls before their Creator. He blessed the food that enslaved hands prepared, the clothes that enslaved fingers sewed, the children that enslaved women were forced to nurse, making each meal a communion of complicity. each garment a vestment of oppression. His God was convenient, demanding suffering from some while rewarding others for inflicting it, requiring submission from the powerless while blessing the powerful with more power. He spoke of heavenly rewards for earthly pain, of celestial justice that would somehow balance terrestrial injustice, of a future paradise that justified present hell for those unlucky enough to be born the wrong color. But Louisa saw through their holy words and righteous poses with the clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose. She watched how they treated the other servants, how they separated mothers from children like wolf pups from their pack, how they sold husbands away from wives as casually as trading horses, how they broke families like breaking bread and called it God's will. She saw the bruises hidden under long sleeves, heard the crying that stopped whenever white footsteps approached, witnessed the daily humiliations that ground spirits into dust and hope into ash. Each act of cruelty was filed away in her memory like evidence in a cosmic court case, each hypocritical prayer noted and stored for a reckoning that was coming whether they believed in justice or not. The basin grew heavier in her hands each day, not with milk, but with purpose, not with nourishment, but with the weight of accumulated grievances that demanded settlement. She tested different substances during her kitchen duties, different mixtures that would work quickly and quietly, learning what would dissolve without trace, what would act without detection, what would bring the sleep that never ends. She practiced the motions in her small room at night, the timing that would need to be perfect, the gentle rocking motion that would look like normal feeding to anyone who might glance into the nursery, the steady breathing that would hide the hammering of her heart when the moment finally came. She rehearsed conversations she might have afterward, prepared answers for questions that would certainly come, crafted a story that would hold together long enough for justice to be served. The basin became her altar, her weapon, her confession booth where she whispered the names of the dead and promised them a kind of resurrection through remembrance and revenge. She polished it every night until it gleamed like moonlight on water, until it reflected her face back to her transformed, until she could see in its smooth surface the woman she was becoming. Each morning she carried it to the nursery with steady hands. Each day she performed her assigned role with perfect obedience. Each night she planned with the patience of someone who understands that some victories require careful preparation. The other servants began to notice something different about her, a stillness that went deeper than quiet, a calm that felt more like the eye of a storm than the absence of wind. But none of them spoke of it. None of them asked questions. None of them interfered with whatever transformation was taking place in the space between her heartbeats. They recognized something ancient stirring, something that had been sleeping in the bones of their people for generations, something that woke up when suffering reached its breaking point, and love had nowhere left to go but toward the blade. It was once just a tool for nourishment, a simple vessel designed to carry life from one mouth to another. Now it was justice with smooth edges and perfect balance, memory given form and purpose, love sharpened into something that could cut through lies and reach the truth that lived in blood and bone. And the silence that comes after screaming stops. The morning light filtered through lace, curtains like filtered truth, soft and deceptive, casting gentle shadows that danced across the nursery floor where justice would soon write its name in silence. Louisa lifted the basin with hands that had stopped trembling weeks ago, feeling its weight settle into her palms like destiny finding its proper place in the world. She had prepared everything the night before with the methodical precision of a pharmacist, the mixture colorless and odorless, undetectable in the white porcelain that had become her altar of reckoning, her communion cup of retribution. Her steps were soft across the nursery floor, each footfall placed with the care of someone walking on graves, her breathing steady as a metronome keeping time for a funeral march. Her heart beat not with fear, but with the rhythm of a woman who had finally found her purpose, who had discovered that some kinds of love require blood to speak their names, that some forms of justice can only be served in porcelain bowls by hands that remember everything. Evelyn knelt beside the crib as always, her morning ritual as predictable as sunrise, hands clasped in the performance of piety that had become as natural to her as breathing. Her voice rose in whispered prayer, words floating through the air like incense at a perverted mass. Bless this child, Lord, and keep him in your perfect care. Guide his servants to know their place in your divine plan. Let them serve with grateful hearts and humble spirits, understanding that their sacrifice brings glory to your name. The words carried the weight of hypocrisy so dense it seemed to make the air itself heavier, charged with the electricity that comes before storms break and lightning finds its target. She prayed for blessings built on others' curses, gave thanks for prosperity watered with tears she had never shed, asked for protection for the child whose life had been purchased with another child's death. Louisa stood behind her, basin in hand, waiting with the patience of stone, the stillness of deep water that appears calm on the surface while powerful currents move beneath. She thought of her own child, the one who never drew breath, never cried, never had the chance to taste the milk that now flowed for a stranger. She thought of his face, perfect in its stillness, beautiful in its brief existence, loved with a ferocity that death could not diminish but only transform into something harder, something that cut both ways. The baby stirred in his silk-lined crib, making the soft sounds that once would have melted any mother's heart, but now only reminded Louisa of the silence that had filled the room when her own child was born sleeping. His tiny fists reached toward nothing, grasping for warmth, for comfort, for the love that surrounded him like armor, while her child had faced the world naked and alone. Evelyn finished her prayer with a theatrical sigh of satisfaction and rose gracefully, turning to face Louisa with that familiar look of expectation, the same expression she might give to a piece of furniture expected to perform its function without complaint or consciousness. Her eyes held no recognition of Louisa's humanity, no acknowledgement of the grief that carved new lines in her face each day, no understanding that the woman standing before her carried more than milk in her careful hands. "Feed him," she commanded with the casual authority of someone who had never questioned her right to command, who had never wondered what happened to orders when they landed in hearts that had been broken too many times to heal properly. She settled into her velvet chair like a queen taking her throne, preparing to watch the daily performance of her dominance, the morning theater that confirmed her place in God's supposedly divine hierarchy. Louisa moved to the crib with the practiced grace of someone who had performed this ritual hundreds of times, her movements fluid as water, natural as breathing, betraying nothing of the storm building in her chest. She lifted the baby with the same gentle care she had always shown, his small body warm and trusting in her arms, innocent of his parents' sins, guilty only of breathing, while another could not. For a moment, something flickered in her chest, not mercy but recognition, not hesitation but acknowledgement of the terrible mathematics of justice. This child was innocent of the crimes committed in his name, blameless for the system that fed him with stolen milk, unknowing of the price paid for his privilege. But innocence was a luxury she could no longer afford, and balance demanded its tribute in the only currency she had left to spend. She positioned the basin carefully, the liquid inside still and perfect as a mirror reflecting not light but memory, not image but intention. The mixture she had prepared held no scent, no color, no warning of what was to come. It looked exactly like the milk that had flowed from her body for months, the nourishment that should have gone to her own child, but had been commandeered for the service of those who saw her as livestock. The baby's lips found the rim of the basin with the instinct that guides all hungry things toward sustenance, trusting in the way that only the innocent can trust, believing that what came from familiar hands would bring comfort and growth. He drank deeply, steadily, his small throat working with the rhythm of life-seeking life, unaware that he was swallowing the concentrated essence of his mother's sins, the distilled poison of a system that demanded some children die so others could live. Evelyn watched with the satisfaction of a plantation owner surveying a productive field, speaking softly about the day's plans while her son consumed his final meal. She talked of visitors coming for tea, of the garden party planned for the following week, of new fabric arrived from France that would make lovely curtains for the parlor. She spoke of life continuing, of prosperity growing, of a future built on the same foundation of cruelty that had always supported her comfort. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned that her nurse has been giving trouble," she said, adjusting her skirts with the unconscious gesture of someone accustomed to being comfortable, asking questions about her children, wanting to know where they were sent. Can you imagine such presumption? As if their temporary attachments could compare to the sacred bonds of Christian families. The baby drank without pause, his eyes fixed on Louisa's face with the trust that breaks hearts or hardens them beyond breaking. She held the basin with unwavering hands, her own face a mask of the same servitude she had worn for years, nothing in her expression betraying the transformation happening inches from Evelyn's unseeing eyes. The shift from nourishment to justice, from life to the balance that life sometimes demands. Minutes passed like hours, each second weighted with the gravity of irreversible choices. The baby's movements began to slow, his eager suckling becoming gentler, then gentler still, like a song gradually fading to silence. His small fingers, which had been grasping at the air, relaxed and stilled. His breathing, which had been quick and shallow with the excitement of feeding, deepened and then began to space itself with longer intervals, like music slowing down until it stops completely. Evelyn was still talking, still planning, still believing in her divine right to rule over others, her voice a constant stream of assumptions and expectations that flowed over the moment like water over stones. She didn't notice immediately when the small sounds stopped, when the tiny movements ceased, when the breathing that had been as constant as her own heartbeat faded into the kind of silence that changes everything. Louisa set the empty basin aside with the same careful precision she had always used, placing it on the side table where it sat like evidence of a crime that was also a prayer, a sin that was also a sacrament. She arranged the baby's small form in her arms, positioning him as if he were merely sleeping, as if this were just another ordinary moment in an ordinary morning that would lead to an ordinary day. When Evelyn finally looked down at her son, when she finally stopped planning and started seeing, her face changed like weather breaking. Confusion came first, a furrowing of her perfect brow as her mind tried to process what her eyes were showing her. Then alarm, sharp and sudden as lightning, followed by a scream that seemed to tear through the morning air like fabric ripping, like the sound the world makes when it breaks in half. She rushed to the crib with movements made clumsy by panic, her careful composure shattered like crystal hitting stone. Her hands trembled as she reached for the child, her voice calling for doctors, for help, for God himself to undo what had been done, to reverse what could not be reversed, to breathe life back into lungs that had finished their work in this world. Louisa watched without moving, without speaking, without allowing her face to show anything but the same placid obedience that had been her mask for years. She saw Evelyn gather the lifeless child in her arms with the desperation of someone trying to hold water, saw her fall to her knees beside the crib as if the weight of realization had broken her legs, saw her begin to pray with a desperation that finally sounded real, that finally carried the weight of genuine loss instead of performed piety. The mistress who had denied her the right to mourn her own child now keened over hers, with a grief so raw it seemed to fill the room like smoke, tears falling like rain on silk blankets that would never again need washing. Her voice broke as she called to heaven, bargaining with a god who had never shown interest in making deals with those who had everything to lose. "Please." "God," Evelyn sobbed, clutching the small body as if her love alone could restart a heart that had finished beating. "Please bring him back. Take anything else, take everything else, but bring him back. I'll free them all, I'll sell everything. Just bring him back." The words tumbled out in a torrent of promises that came too late. Bargains offered after the market had closed. Prayers that carried the bitter taste of justice finally served. The irony was perfect, cruel, complete in its terrible symmetry. The woman who had proclaimed herself God's chosen servant now begged the same God to undo the justice that had been served in his name. The mistress who had stolen milk and motherhood now learned what it meant to lose both. To hold a child who would never grow, never speak, never call her name again. Louisa remained standing, still holding the empty basin like a communion cup after the wine has been consumed, watching as the prayer that would never be answered filled the room with the sound of true grief, the kind that comes from understanding too late what has been lost and why it can never be recovered. She had turned nourishment into reckoning, milk into memory, silence into the only justice she would ever be allowed to claim. And in that moment, surrounded by the sound of a mother learning what it meant to lose everything, Louisa felt something she had not felt since her own child died. She felt complete. Dawn found Louisa sitting exactly where she had been when Evelyn's screams brought the household running like thunder calling rain. She made no attempt to flee, no effort to hide what she had done, no desperate scramble for escape that might have postponed, but never prevented the reckoning that was already walking up the front steps in the form of constables with chains and questions. Her hands remained folded in her lap, her back straight against the nursery chair, her eyes fixed on some distant point that existed beyond the walls of the Whitfield mansion, beyond the borders of Charleston, beyond the reach of earthly justice. When they asked her why, when they demanded explanations for the inexplicable, she said simply, "I gave them life. They gave me death. I returned both." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of understanding that spread outward until they reached every corner of a society built on the assumption that some lives mattered more than others, that some mothers deserved to grieve while others should accept loss as their natural lot. The constables came with chains that had held countless others before her, their metal links worn smooth by the wrists of people who had dared to assert their humanity in a world determined to deny it. They brought questions she had no interest in answering, demands for remorse she could not feel, expectations of shame for actions that felt more like sacrament than sin. But Louisa had no more words to offer a world that had never listened to her voice anyway. She had spoken her piece in porcelain and silence, written her story in the space between heartbeats, delivered her message in the only language they would understand. The trial was swift. The verdict as predictable as sunrise. The outcome determined before the first witness took the stand. Charleston society demanded blood for blood, even though they had been taking it for centuries without trial, without justice, without acknowledgement that the blood they spilled belonged to people who had names, dreams, children of their own who mattered as much as any white child ever could. The courtroom filled with the cream of Southern society, men in fine suits and women in silk dresses who came to witness the punishment of someone who had dared to disturb their carefully constructed world. They spoke of her as a monster, a mad woman driven by jealousy rather than grief, a creature so far removed from human understanding that her actions could only be explained by madness or evil, never by the simple mathematics of justice finally balancing the scales. The newspapers called it an isolated incident, the work of a damaged mind that bore no relation to the system that had created the damage in the first place. They wrote of her as an aberration, a single bad apple that proved nothing about the orchard, a random act of violence that had no connection to the structured violence that surrounded it like air. They never acknowledged the children who died unnamed, the mothers who grieved in silence, the families torn apart by auction blocks and bill of sales. But in the quarters, in the kitchens, in the places where enslaved mothers gathered to share their stories and their sorrow, Louisa became something else entirely. Her name was whispered like a prayer, like a promise, like a warning to those who thought suffering would always be silent and submission would always be certain. They sang her story in lullabies whose true meaning was hidden beneath innocent melodies, coded messages passed from mother to daughter about the woman who had made milk into justice and silence into song. They spoke of her in the tobacco fields when the overseers were too far away to hear, in the cotton rows where backs bent under the weight of other people's prosperity, in the rice swamps where feet sank into mud that had been mixed with tears for generations. Her story traveled faster than any whip, spread wider than any plantation, grew stronger with each telling until it became less about one woman's revenge and more about the possibility that love could be fierce enough to demand payment for what had been stolen. On the day of her execution, they dressed her in white, not knowing they were crowning her in the color of the milk that had been her weapon and her gift, not understanding that they were robbing her in the same purity they claimed to represent, but had never practiced. She walked to the gallows with the same steady pace she had used in the nursery, her back straight, her head high, her eyes clear with the kind of peace that comes from knowing you have spoken your truth regardless of who was listening. The crowd that gathered to watch her die was larger than any Sunday congregation, filled with people who came to witness the end of someone who had reminded them that their comfort was built on others' pain, that their children's laughter was purchased with other mothers' tears, that their God was either asleep or choosing sides in ways that revealed more about them than about divine justice. When they asked for her final words, when they offered her the chance to beg forgiveness from the people who had never forgiven her for being human, she looked out over the crowd with eyes that held no fear, no regret, no apology for actions that had been necessary in ways they would never understand. "Every mother remembers," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the morning air. "Every child matters. Even mine." The rope took her breath but not her story, ended her voice but not her message, stopped her heart but not the love that had driven her to transform milk into memory and silence, into the only justice available to someone who had been denied every other kind. They buried her body in the same unmarked ground where they had put her child, thinking that earth could hold what they could not destroy, that dirt could silence what they could not answer. But her name carved itself into the memory of every woman who had been forced to choose between survival and motherhood, every servant who had watched their children disappear into unmarked graves while others lived surrounded by luxury. In Charleston's grand houses, mothers began sleeping lighter, watching their milk with new attention, remembering Louisa's lesson that even the gentlest hands could carry the sharpest justice when love had nowhere else to go.